Imagine a map of the world spread before you. At first glance, the borders between nations may look like neat lines, clear divisions that separate one country from another. But look closer, and you will see twists, oddities, and curious stories written into those lines. Some borders zigzag, as if drawn by an unsteady hand. Others create tiny islands of one country entirely inside another. A few lines stretch in strange patterns that make little sense until you uncover the history behind them. Welcome to this journey across 30 of the world's strangest borders. Tonight, we will drift through enclaves, exclaves, narrow strips of land, and winding frontiers shaped by history, culture, conflict, and sometimes sheer accident. As we move slowly from one story to the next, I invite you to let your mind relax and wander, as if following a river's flow across the map. If you enjoy this calm exploration, you are welcome to subscribe to the channel. That way, whenever you wish to unwind, you'll have more relaxing, educational journeys waiting for you. And if you feel like it, share in the comments where you are watching from your city, your country, and the time of night or day. It is always wonderful to see how people across the globe connect in these quiet travels. Now, let us step into our first border story. Beginning with one of the most curious cases in all of geography. An area so divided that villages themselves are split down the middle. We start in Europe, on the border of Belgium and the Netherlands, in a place known as Baarle. Baarle is a town unlike any other. It is made up of Baarle-Hertog, which belongs to Belgium, and Baarle-Nassau, which belongs to the Netherlands. The two are intertwined like pieces of a puzzle. Instead of a single border line circling one town, the land is broken into more than 24 separate enclaves. You might find yourself standing in a Belgian enclave, completely surrounded by Dutch territory. Then, just a short walk away, you could step into a Dutch enclave, that is, itself surrounded by Belgian land. This odd situation came about from medieval treaties and land swaps between lords, long before modern states existed. Over time, the agreements stuck, and when the borders were formalized, the enclaves were kept. Today, this arrangement creates strange everyday experiences. Some houses literally straddle the border, with the front door determining whether the home is officially in Belgium or the Netherlands. Shops must follow the laws of the country they are located in, which means in one part of the street. Closing times may differ from the other side. Tourists love to visit Baarle for this unique mix, and locals have grown used to their checkerboard identity. This is just one example of how borders reflect human history-out agreements, conflicts, and compromises. But as we move on, you'll see how even natural features like rivers and mountains, which might seem straightforward dividers, often complicate things even more. Let's continue deeper into these fascinating lines, where geography becomes both a puzzle and a storybook. When we think of borders, we often imagine lines drawn across valleys or plains. But some of the most unusual lie at the very top of the world-end mountain summits, where nations touch the sky together. One of the most famous examples is found in the Himalayas, on Mount Everest, the highest mountain on Earth. Mount Everest rises to an astonishing 8,849 meters above sea level. Its summit, brushed by icy winds, and kissed by thin air that very few humans can endure. And yet, this lonely, snow-covered point is not just a natural wonder, but also a political border. The summit of Everest is shared between two nations, Nepal to the south and China's Tibet Autonomous Region to the north. Climbers ascending the mountain can approach from either side. Those climbing from Nepal follow the famous South Col route, a path lined with history and memorials to past expeditions. Meanwhile, those who come from Tibet ascend the North Col, a colder, windier, and technically different path. At the top, both routes converge where climbers find themselves standing on two countries at once. This dual ownership creates fascinating legal and cultural situations. For example, the name of the mountain itself differs depending on which side you approach. In Nepal, it is Sagam Cbb, meaning head of the sky. In Tibet, it is Chamalungma, meaning mother, goddess of the world. Each name carries with it spiritual reverence and cultural identity. Yet, internationally, it is known by the name Everest, given in the 19th century after Sir George Everest, a British surveyor. Imagine, for a moment, you are standing at the roof of the world, one boot in Nepal, the other in Tibet. In that single step, you embody centuries of cultural heritage, colonial naming traditions, modern geopolitics, and humanity's eternal desire to explore the unknown. The summit becomes not just a place of natural awe, but also a living border marker. This is not the only mountaintop shared in such a way. Around the world, we see similar divisions. Mont Blanc in Europe, shared between France and Italy, has been the subject of heated debate over the exact placement of the frontier. On a clear day, tourists marvel at the sight, unaware that centuries of arguments and maps have been dedicated to a snowy ridge high above. Mountains are often used to define nations, acting as natural barriers. Yet, when human ambition climbs above those barriers, the borders appear not as protective walls, but as invisible lines on landscapes that are far older and grander than our political history. From peaks that touch the sky, let us descend now to borders that barely rise at all, but instead wind like ribbons through cities and streets, shaping everyday life in ways that are both strange and fascinating. If mountains make borders feel distant and untouchable, then there are places where borders feel strangely intimate, so close that they pass right through people's homes and even bedrooms. One of the most unusual examples lies in Europe, in the villages of Baarle in the Netherlands and Baarle in Belgium. At first glance, this small town looks like any other peaceful European settlement, with cobblestone streets, cozy houses, and small. But upon closer inspection, you'll notice something peculiar: white crosses and metal markers embedded in the ground, cutting across pavements, running through gardens, and even slicing straight through buildings. These are not decorations. They are the international border itself, dividing Belgian territory from Dutch territory in one of the most complicated patchworks in the world. Baarle is famous for its enclaves and counter-enclaves. In simple terms, Baarle is made up of little pieces of Belgium, surrounded entirely by Dutch land. But within some of these Belgian pieces, there are smaller Dutch pieces, again like a puzzle within a puzzle. This bizarre arrangement dates back to medieval treaties, when land was traded between dukes and counts, not as large territories, but as tiny, scattered plots. Over time, instead of being resolved, these fragmented territories persisted. The result is a town where the border literally runs through everyday life. In some cases, a house can be half in Belgium and half in the Netherlands. This even creates amusing legal differences. For example, shops and restaurants used to exploit variations in opening hours between the two countries. A cafe owner could legally close their Dutch side, but keep the Belgian side open. In practice, this sometimes meant that guests only needed to move their tables across the room to stay longer. The borderline is so accepted by locals that it adds charm rather than inconvenience. Tourists come to walk the zigzagging frontier, taking photos of themselves stepping from one country into another, often without even crossing a street. This town is not just a curiosity, reflects how human history, politics, and daily life become intertwined. It also shows that borders, often thought of as barriers, can also become attractions, symbols of cooperation, and reminders that geography shapes communities in unexpected ways. From a border that slices through living rooms, let us now journey to a different kind of division, a river boundary that separates nations but also brings them together through commerce, history, and culture. Rivers are some of the oldest natural dividers of human societies. Long before maps or satellite images existed, rivers were the clear, undeniable lines that separated one community's territory from another. They were barriers, but also lifelines, carrying trade, culture, and ideas along their currents. One of the most fascinating examples of a river that both connects and divides is the Danube. The Danube is Europe's second longest river, flowing for nearly 3,000 kilometers through 10 countries: Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Moldova, and Ukraine. Few rivers in the world are so international, touching so many cultures, economies, and political systems. And along its winding course, it often forms the official boundaries between nations. Take, for example, the border between Bulgaria and Romania. For nearly 500 kilometers, the Danube marks the line, curving and meandering through fertile plains and historic towns. On one side of the water lies the Bulgarian port city of Rus. On the opposite side lies the Romanian city of Giurgiu. The two are connected by a bridge known as the Friendship Bridge, symbolizing cooperation between the two countries. Yet historically, that same river boundary has been the site of wars, disputes, and struggles for dominance. The Danube also forms part of the border between Slovakia and Hungary, and further downstream between Serbia and Croatia. In fact, the meandering nature of the river has led to border disagreements. When a river shifts course naturally, should the political boundary follow the new path or remain fixed to the old riverbed? This simple question has created lasting debates. One such dispute between Croatia and Serbia has persisted since the breakup of Yugoslavia, with some territories now known as disputed enclaves. Yet the Danube is more than a line of separation. It is also a unifying force. Its waters carry ships that transport grain, oil, luxury goods, and technology between Western and Eastern Europe. It supports tourism, with river cruises offering travelers the chance to see multiple countries and cultures within a single journey. From the medieval castles of Austria to the lush Danube Delta in Romania, the river serves as a natural corridor of history, art, and biodiversity. The Danube reminds us that borders created by rivers are never only about division. They are about coexistence. Where one shore ends, another begins, and yet both share the same water, the same fish, and the same seasonal floods. This duality of separation and connection, what makes river borders so fascinating? From the wide flowing Danube, we now move to a border that is as jagged as it is confusing, a patchwork of lines where small villages find themselves, belonging to one country on paper, but surrounded entirely by another in practice. When we think of borders, we often imagine straight lines, long fences, or natural features like mountains and rivers. But some borders look nothing like this. Instead, they resemble puzzle pieces of land belonging to one country scattered inside another, forming what we call enclaves and exclaves. Few places in the world illustrate this better than the town of Baarle, split between Belgium and the Netherlands. At first glance, Baarle might appear to be a normal, peaceful European village. Cobbled streets, small shops, families cycling past brick houses. Yet, beneath this charming exterior lies one of the most complex border situations on Earth. The town is divided into Baarle, which belongs to the Netherlands, and Baarle, which belongs to Belgium. The strange part, the Belgian sections are not all connected. Instead, they are scattered in little patches, 22 Belgian enclaves inside Dutch territory. And within those Belgian enclaves, 7 Dutch enclaves exist. A true patchwork of sovereignty. This means that walking down a single street, you might pass from one country into another without even realizing it. In fact, the borders are marked on the ground with white crosses and lines. Shops and restaurants often have a line running right through their buildings. So technically, one half might be in Belgium, the other in the Netherlands. For example, when laws differed about shop opening times, some store owners would move their entrance to whichever side of the border allowed longer business hours. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when each country imposed different restrictions, Baarle once again faced amusing and confusing scenarios. A restaurant could serve customers on the Belgian side of the dining room, but not on the Dutch side door, vice versa, depending on the regulations of the moment. Residents became experts at navigating dual sets of laws, taxes, and policies, all while living in the same small town. The origins of this puzzle go back centuries to medieval feudal agreements between dukes and counts. Back then, land was traded and divided not according to simple geographic rules, but as part of complex negotiations of marriage, inheritance, and politics. Over time, as borders solidified into modern nation-states, these medieval landholdings became frozen into the quirky map we see today. For tourists, Baarle has become a destination of curiosity. Travelers from around the world come to stand with one foot in Belgium and the other in the Netherlands, capturing playful photos. Cafes proudly display their unusual location, and the town markets itself as Europe's most complicated border. For locals, it's a normal part of life. For geographers, it's a real-world lesson in how history, culture, and politics leave lasting imprints on the land. Enclaves like Baarle highlight how human decisions about borders often defy the logic of geography. Instead of clear divisions, they reveal compromise, stubbornness, and the weight of centuries. They also show the resilience of communities who adapt to living in places where the rules shift every few meters. But Baarle is not alone. Around the world, enclaves and exclaves create some of the most unusual border situations imaginable. Consider Kaliningrad, a piece of Russia wedged between Poland and Lithuania, cut off from the main Russian Federation. Or the exclave of Alaska, separated from the rest of the United States by Canada. These examples remind us that borders are not always neat or logical. They are artifacts of history, of treaties signed and battles fought long ago. What makes it so fascinating is how peacefully this complexity functions. While borders elsewhere spark disputes and tensions, here they bring a sense of identity and pride. Locals see themselves not as trapped by borders, but as living in a truly international community. It is an example of how even the strangest geographic arrangements can thrive when shaped by cooperation rather than conflict. Imagine drifting off to sleep while picturing the tiny, winding streets of Baarle, where a painted line across a cafe floor marks the divide between two nations. It's both absurd and poetic reminder that the world is full of places where human history and geography overlap in unexpected ways. From the puzzle-like enclaves of Europe, we turn next to one of the most famous borders in the world. One that has fascinated travelers and historians for centuries. Straight in places, jagged in others, it hides stories of compromise, exploration, and even accidents that shaped two of the largest nations on Earth. Stretching across forests, lakes, mountains, and endless prairies. The border between the United States and Canada is the longest international boundary in the world, measuring about 8,891 kilometers, or 5,525 miles. It is a line that touches both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, runs through the Great Lakes, and even continues into the Arctic. Unlike the tangled puzzle of Baarle we just explored, the US-Canada border is monumental in scale. Yet, despite its length, it is often called the world's friendliest border. But the story of how this border was drawn is anything but simple. In fact, many parts of it are the result of compromises, treaties, and even mistakes in surveying. The border officially began to take shape after the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the American Revolutionary War. At that time, Britain and the new United States agreed on general boundaries, but the details were vague. For example, the treaty described the border around the Great Lakes, but the maps used were inaccurate. This led to disputes over where rivers began or which islands belonged to which side. One of the most curious features of the border is known as the Northwest Angle, a small piece of Minnesota that juts up into Canadian territory. If you look at a map, it appears as a little square sticking out, separated from the rest of the United States by Lake of the Woods. The Northwest Angle exists because of a mapping error. Early treaties had defined the border as running from the Lake of the Woods due west to the Mississippi River. But explorers later realized the Mississippi didn't flow that far north. By the time this was discovered, the line had already been set, leaving behind this strange peninsula of American land, surrounded by Canada. The 49th parallel is another key feature of the border. In 1818, the US and Britain agreed that west of the Great Lakes, the boundary would follow this line of latitude all the way to the Rocky Mountains. If you look at a globe, you'll see this long, straight line slicing across the continent, separating states like North Dakota and Montana from Canada's prairie provinces. It is one of the longest straight borders in the world. Yet even here, straight lines create oddities. One famous example is the tiny village of Point Roberts in Washington state, because the 49th parallel cuts through the Sowerson Peninsula south of Vancouver. Point Roberts ended up as a U.S. exclave. To reach the rest of Washington by land, residents must drive through Canada. This means that families living there must cross an international border just to go shopping, visit doctors, or commute to school. For children in Point Roberts, taking the school bus involves 2 border crossings every day. Another curiosity along the border is the Haskell Free Library and Opera House, which sits directly on the line between Derby Line, Vermont, and Stansted, Quebec. Inside the library, a black line on the floor marks the border. The front door is in the US, the main reading room in Canada, and the stage of the Opera House in one country, while the audience sits in the other. For decades, people from both sides have visited freely, making it one of the few buildings in the world deliberately constructed across an international boundary. Despite these oddities, the US-Canada border is remarkably peaceful. Unlike many borders defined by walls, fences, or armed guards, much of it remains unmarked and open, especially in remote wilderness. Still, it is carefully managed. A joint organization called the International Boundary Commission maintains boundary markers, clears vegetation, and ensures that the line remains visible even in forests. If you were to fly over the border in these areas, you would see a long cut line of cleared trees stretching for miles. A thin scar across the landscape, marking where one country ends and another begins. Beyond geography, this border tells a story about 2 nations that have grown together while preserving distinct cultures. Canada and the United States share trade routes, economic ties, and millions of cross-border family connections. Cities like Detroit and Windsor or Niagara Falls and Niagara sit opposite each other, linked by bridges that symbolize cooperation. At the same time, each side reflects its own history. French heritage on the Canadian side of Quebec, or the legacy of the American Revolution along the eastern states. For travelers, the US-Canada border is a place of fascination. From the grandeur of Niagara Falls, straddling the line between Ontario and New York, to the peaceful crossing points of the Northern Rockies, it shows how geography and human decisions create spaces of both separation and unity. Economically, it is the world's busiest trade border, with billions of dollars in goods flowing across each year cars, technology, energy, and food. Yet at night, under the northern lights or among the still forests of Maine, it can feel as though the border is invisible, a silent reminder of human agreements etched into the natural world. When we compare this boundary to others, Its calmness feels almost luxurious. Instead of military zones or barbed wire, here we see families taking vacations, tourists snapping photos, and communities tied together by rivers and lakes. As you picture this vast line stretching across the continent, imagine drifting into rest with the image of a cleared forest line, silent and straight, stretching endlessly to the horizon. It is a man-made line, but one softened by the natural world, where rivers, prairies, and snow quietly flow across human divisions. From this longest of borders, let us now shift to one of the smallest but one of the most curious in all of Europe. A border not measured in thousands of miles, but in a single street, the line that divides the Italian town of Gorizia from the Slovenian town of Nova Gorica. A place where a simple square becomes an international stage. In the northeast of Italy, nestled in the rolling hills and vineyards of Friuli-Venezia Giulia, lies the town of Gorizia. Just a short walk away, on the Slovenian side, sits Nova Gorica, its younger twin. These two towns are divided and united by a border that has shifted with the tides of history. What makes them so fascinating is that, in many ways, they are one community split by a line drawn in the aftermath of war. The story begins in the early 20th century. Gorizia was once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a multicultural region where Italians, Slovenes, and Germans lived side by side. After World War I, Italy annexed the area. But after World War II, the map of Europe was redrawn again. The Allies and the new socialist government of Yugoslavia debated where the frontier should lie. In 1947, the Paris Peace Treaty awarded much of the surrounding territory to Yugoslavia. Italy kept Gorizia, but the new Yugoslav authorities decided to build a completely new town just across the border, Nova Gorica, meaning New Gorizia. For decades, a harsh iron curtain border ran through this land. Barbed wire, fences, and border guards separated Italian Gorizia from Yugoslav Nova Gorica. Families were divided, and neighbors who had once lived in the same community suddenly found themselves citizens of different countries, unable to cross freely. But in the 21st century, this strange border transformed. Slovenia gained independence in 1991 and later joined the European Union. Then, in 2007, Slovenia entered the Schengen area, which abolished systematic border checks. The line that had once divided became a place of connection again. Today, the most symbolic spot is Transalpina Square, also called Trg Evrop, the Square of Europe. A simple, open plaza where children play and friends meet. Yet beneath their feet runs the invisible line separating Italy and Slovenia. Once, a wall and barbed wire cut through this square. Now, people walk across without noticing where one country ends and another begins. A stone marker remains, a quiet reminder of history. The square has become a symbol of European unity. In 2025, Gorizia and Nova Gorica will share the title of European Capital of Culture, hosting events that highlight how border regions can evolve from division to cooperation. The two towns now collaborate on tourism, education, and culture. Visitors can enjoy Italian espresso on one side and Slovenian potica cake on the other within minutes. The geography that once created tension now offers richness in diversity. Economically, this area also reflects the luxury of borderland trade. Italian markets attract Slovenian shoppers, while Slovenian casinos and modern hotels bring Italians across the line. Tourism thrives because the towns offer travelers the chance to experience two countries, two languages, and two cuisines in a single afternoon. Wine lovers, in particular, are drawn to the surrounding Kallio and Brda hills, where Italian and Slovenian vineyards weave together seamlessly, ignoring the border that humans once fought over. Yet, perhaps the most moving part of this story is how ordinary people experienced the border. During the Cold War, families would come to the fence, waving to relatives they could not visit. Weddings, funerals, and birthdays were celebrated from opposite sides. Today, older residents remember those times with bittersweet emotions, grateful for the freedom to cross, but aware of the decades lost to division. When compared to the vast expanses of the US-Canada border, Gorizia and Nova Gorica show us another perspective. How a single street or square can carry the weight of geopolitics. Here, borders are not just lines on maps, but lived reality shaping daily life, culture, and even identity. As you imagine this square tonight, picture the cobblestones beneath your feet. Imagine walking slowly from one side to the other, from Italian to Slovenian soil, with no checkpoint, no guard, no barrier, only the memory of what once was. The line is still there, but in spirit it has dissolved into something softer, something more hopeful. It is this paradox, the border as both division and bridge, that makes Gorizia and Nova Gorica one of the most fascinating case studies of modern Europe. A story where geography whispers lessons about resilience, change, and the ability of people to reclaim unity from division. Now, as we leave the gentle square of Europe behind, let us journey eastward, where rivers and mountains carve one of the world's most intricate frontiers, the twisting and dramatic borderlands of India and Bangladesh, where enclaves once created a puzzle of sovereignty that seemed almost impossible to solve. If there is any border in the world that once resembled a cartographic riddle, it is the border between India and Bangladesh. For decades, this frontier was home to one of the most complex territorial arrangements ever recorded in modern history. Hundreds of enclaves scattered like puzzle pieces, many of them nested inside one another. To understand this peculiarity, let us go back to the time of the Mughal Empire and the small princely states that held sway in Bengal. Local rulers would exchange parcels of land during card games, wagers, or small military skirmishes. Over centuries, these irregular exchanges created tiny pockets of land belonging to one ruler, but surrounded entirely by another's territory. When colonial empires rose and fell, and later when India and Pakistan separated in 1947, these scattered patches of land became a major issue. When East Pakistan became Bangladesh in 1971, the problem persisted. By that time, the border contained over 160 enclaves. Imagine living in one of these places. You might be a citizen of India, but your village was completely surrounded by Bangladesh. To reach your own country, you had to cross foreign soil. Some enclaves were so small they contained a single household. Others, like Dehala Kagrabari, were extraordinary. A piece of India inside Bangladesh, which itself contained a Bangladeshi enclave, and within that enclave, another tiny piece of India. This was the only known example of a third-order enclave in the world. Life in these enclaves was far from idyllic, without easy access to services from the government of their own country. They lacked proper schools, healthcare, or police protection. Crossing into surrounding territory was technically illegal without permission. But in practice, it happened constantly, since everyday life required markets, travel, and communication. For decades, negotiations attempted to resolve this confusion. Finally, in 2015, after years of debate, India and Bangladesh signed the Land Boundary Agreement, exchanging territory to simplify the border. Citizens were given the choice to stay in their homes and adopt a new nationality or relocate to their mother country. Overnight, some of the world's most peculiar enclaves vanished from maps, replaced by a more rational boundary. Economically, this settlement was a relief. A clear frontier allows for smoother trade and tourism, crucial for regions like West Bengal and northern Bangladesh, where agriculture, textiles, and cross-border markets fuel local economies. The new clarity also strengthened political ties, transforming one of the world's strangest borders into a symbol of cooperation. Yet, there remains a charm in remembering the complexity that once existed here. The idea that a farmer could plant his rice fields in India, while his house stood in Bangladesh, or that a child might cross to international frontiers just to visit a neighbor's home, is almost unbelievable. This strangeness has fascinated geographers, historians, and travelers alike, adding to the sense that borders are as much stories as they are lines. For those who love maps, the old India-Bangladesh frontier was a cartographic wonderland, filled with twists, turns, and nested shapes that looked more like a game board than a political map. It reminded us that the geography of power is rarely simple, and often shaped by forgotten tales of kings, empires, and chance. As night deepens and your thoughts drift, imagine looking at one of those old maps. The enclaves scatter like stars across the paper, each a small island of sovereignty in a sea of another nation. Some are bright, some faint, but all carry with them centuries of history condensed into curious fragments. And then imagine them slowly fading away, blending back into the surrounding land, as if the world has exhaled, relieved to let go of its complications. From this strange puzzle in South Asia, we move westward, toward Africa, where another border tells a very different tale. Here, the natural world, rather than politics, dictates division. A desert frontier that is less about lines and more about vast expanses. The boundary between Egypt and Sudan, home to one of the most peculiar disputes unearth a piece of land that no country officially claims. Among the deserts of northeastern Africa, where the sands stretch endlessly beneath a blazing sun, lies a border anomaly so unusual that it has been called the world's only unclaimed piece of habitable land. This patch is known as Baarle, a trapezoid of desert measuring roughly 2,060 square kilometers, located between Egypt and Sudan. What makes it extraordinary is that both countries refuse to claim it, making it a true geopolitical oddity. The story begins in the late 19th century, when Britain controlled Egypt and Sudan. In 1899, the border between the two was drawn along the 22nd parallel north. But only 3 years later, in 1902, colonial administrators made a practical adjustment. They shifted Sudan's control slightly north to include the Halib Triangle, a fertile coastal region on the Red Sea that was more accessible from Sudan. In exchange, Egypt was given control of Baarle, a much less hospitable tract of desert used by tribes with stronger ties to Egypt after independence. Egypt and Sudan both wanted the Halib Triangle, which offered coastline, fisheries, and potential mineral wealth. But claiming that area meant rejecting Baarle, since accepting one claim meant relinquishing the other. And so, both countries insist the other owns Baarle, leaving it as a rare piece of land on earth that no nation claims as its own. Baarle itself is harsh. It has no permanent water sources, no towns, and very little vegetation. Temperatures soar, and only nomadic herders occasionally pass through. Yet, paradoxically, its emptiness has drawn international fascination. Over the past decade, adventurers and eccentric individuals have planted flags and declared Baarle their personal kingdom. In 2014, an American traveler famously raised a flag there and proclaimed it the Kingdom of North Sudan, hoping to grant his daughter the title of princess. Of course, such declarations have no legal recognition, but they highlight how captivating unclaimed land can be in a world where almost every square kilometer is mapped, disputed, or governed. Economically, Baarle holds little immediate value compared to the rich Halib Triangle. Still, its story illustrates how politics, geography, and colonial history intertwine. What is useful, land coastlines, rivers, farmland, becomes coveted, while barren spaces like Baarle are avoided, even rejected. And yet, in an age of tourism, social media, and global curiosity, Baarle has become famous precisely because it is unwanted. Its notoriety has even attracted niche forms of tourism, where explorers dream of stepping foot in a place few others have ever visited. For those drifting into sleep, Baarle is almost like a mirage. Imagine a patch of desert where the sand dunes glow under moonlight, untouched by flags, governments, or armies. A place that belongs to no one, and, in a way, to everyone who wonders about it. It is a reminder that even in the modern world, with satellites and digital maps, mystery still lingers. The frontier between Egypt and Sudan thus gives us a paradoxical border, a coveted triangle on the coast, and an abandoned trapezoid in the desert. It shows how value, whether measured in natural resources or in human imagination, determines the weight of geography. From the empty silence of Baarle, we now cross over to another frontier shaped not by deserts, but by rivers and shifting landscapes. In Europe, where countries often meet along winding waterways, the question of where one bank ends and another begins can become surprisingly complicated. And in the case of Slovakia and Hungary, a hydroelectric dam gave birth to one of the strangest water-based border disputes in the modern era. The Danube River, Europe's second longest river after the Volga, flows gracefully from Germany's Black Forest to the Black Sea, passing through 10 countries along its journey. It has always been more than a river. It is a corridor of trade, culture, and connection, threading together Central and Eastern Europe. But like many rivers that cross borders, the Danube has also been a source of conflict. One of the most fascinating disputes involves Slovakia and Hungary, whose quarrel over a hydroelectric project reshaped not only their relationship, but also the geography of their shared border. The story centers on the Gabne-Maros project, a joint hydroelectric dam system agreed upon by Czechoslovakia and Hungary in the 1970s. The plan was ambitious: a series of dams, reservoirs, and locks designed to generate electricity, improve navigation, and prevent flooding along the Danube. For Czechoslovakia, the project promised energy, security, and industrial growth. For Hungary, it offered flood protection and improved shipping. Both nations viewed it as a symbol of socialist cooperation during the Cold War. But when Hungary transitioned toward democracy in the late 1980s, environmental concerns and rising costs turned public opinion against the project. Activists argued that the dams would flood villages, destroy ecosystems, and threaten the unique wetlands of the Szigets region. In 1989, Hungary officially abandoned its side of the project, halting construction at Nagy Maros. Czechoslovakia, unwilling to give up, proceeded alone. It diverted the Danube's main channel into a massive artificial canal on Slovak territory, channeling water to power the Gab Dam. This unilateral move drastically reduced water levels along the original riverbed, forming the natural border, effectively altering the geography between the two countries. Claiming that Slovakia had violated international law by unilaterally changing a shared river, Slovakia countered that Hungary had broken the original treaty by withdrawing. The dispute eventually reached the International Court of Justice, ICJ, in The Hague in 1997. The court delivered a nuanced ruling. Both sides were in the wrong, but both also had obligations to cooperate. The ICJ emphasized that international rivers require joint management, and neither country could simply walk away from agreements or impose its will on the other. Since then, Hungary and Slovakia have managed the situation through fragile compromises, but tensions remain. What makes this border so strange is that, unlike a fixed mountain or coastline, the Danube is alive, shifting, and redirected by human engineering. The line between Hungary and Slovakia is no longer just a natural riverbank. It is partly an artificial channel designed for energy and navigation, yet contested in spirit. The border reflects not only geography, but also the challenges of balancing technology, environment, and sovereignty. Economically, the GAB project supplies a significant portion of Slovakia's renewable energy, strengthening its role in regional power grids. Tourism also thrives as river cruises pass through locks and wetlands, while visitors come to see the engineering marvel. For Hungary, however, the altered river remains a sore memory of lost trust and environmental risk. From a broader perspective, this border dispute highlights how river sources of life and travel can become battlegrounds of law and politics. Where one bank begins and another ends may seem simple on a map, but in reality, flowing waters are dynamic and often defy strict lines. As you drift further into relaxation, imagine the Danube at twilight. Its surface glimmers silver under the moon. Drifting between reeds and stone embankments. On one side, Slovak towns glow with the hum of hydroelectric energy. On the other, Hungarian villages sit in quieter reflection, watching the water flow by. The river carries centuries of history, but it also carries disputes, compromises, and the constant reminder that nature is not easily contained by human borders. From the waters of the Danube, let us now move across continents to Asia, where borders do not simply follow rivers or deserts, but sometimes twist into shapes so unusual they resemble puzzles drawn on a map. One of the most intricate examples is the enclave maze of Bangladesh and India, where borders once resembled scattered islands of sovereignty. Few borders in the world are as bewildering as those once found between India and Bangladesh. For decades, their shared frontier was not a simple dividing line, but a chaotic mosaic of enclaves and counter-enclaves. Imagine looking at a map and seeing dozens of small islands of one country completely surrounded by the territory of another, some even containing tiny pockets of the opposite nation inside them. This bizarre arrangement was one of the most tangled border situations in history. These enclaves were known as the Cooch Behar Enclaves, located in the northern region where India's state of West Bengal meets Bangladesh. There were over 160 separate enclaves scattered along the border, covering a combined area of more than 70 square kilometers. Inside them lived tens of thousands of people, caught between two nations, yet often belonging fully to neither. The origins of this puzzle date back centuries, long before India or Bangladesh existed as independent states. Historians believe the enclaves arose from treaty disputes and land swaps between two feudal kingdoms, the Kingdom of Cooch Behar and the Mughal Empire. Over time, patches of land under different rulers became stranded on the wrong side as political boundaries shifted. When India and Pakistan were partitioned in 1947, these enclaves were inherited by India and East Pakistan, later Bangladesh. The result was almost absurd. You could walk through a Bangladeshi village, cross into a tiny Indian enclave, step into a smaller Bangladeshi enclave inside it, and then exit again into India within a short distance. There was even one counter enclave inside India, inside Bangladesh. It was geography at its most confusing. Life inside the enclaves was extremely difficult. Residents often had no access to basic services such as schools, electricity, or hospitals. Because their home government could not realistically provide support across foreign territory, many enclave dwellers felt stateless, as traveling to their own country required crossing international borders without official permits. Economically, people relied heavily on local arrangements, barter trade, or smuggling, since official transport and communication were almost impossible. For decades, India and Bangladesh negotiated but failed to solve the problem. Politics, nationalism, and bureaucracy delayed change, leaving enclave residents in limbo. Yet, in 2015, a historic agreement finally ended the centuries-old anomaly. Under the Land Boundary Agreement, India and Bangladesh exchanged territories. Enclaves were eliminated, and residents were given the choice of nationality. Most chose to stay where they lived, adopting citizenship of the country surrounding them. The resolution was celebrated as a rare example of peaceful, cooperative border settlement in a world where borders often lead to conflict. It also simplified life dramatically for enclave residents, who could now travel, vote, and access services without fear of crossing invisible boundaries. From an economic and cultural perspective, this agreement had ripple effects. Trade routes became easier to manage, security improved, and communities, once divided by invisible lines, began reconnecting. The region has since seen gradual development, with new infrastructure, schools, and healthcare facilities reaching former enclaves. But the memory of the enclave maze lingers as a fascinating example of how history and geography can create surreal realities. Borders are usually drawn to separate nations, clearly, yet here they resembled a scattered chessboard of sovereignty. As you picture this, imagine walking through green rice fields at dusk. Villages glow with lanterns, and children run between homes. In the past, a single step could have meant crossing into a different country without realizing it. Now, the land feels whole again, its people finally belonging somewhere after generations of uncertainty. From this intricate puzzle of borders in South Asia, let us now drift further west, to a line drawn straight through a desert where two nations meet in one of the most symmetrical borders on Earth. The straight-edged frontier between Egypt and Sudan, where even a no-man's land of disputed territory remains unclaimed by either side. Among all the curious borders of the world, there is one that feels almost like a paradox, a patch of desert that no country claims. This is Baarle, a barren quadrilateral of sand located between Egypt and Sudan. While most nations have fought, sometimes fiercely, over every inch of land, Baarle stands out as the opposite of territory neither side wishes to own. The story begins with colonial history. In 1899, Britain, which controlled both Egypt and Sudan at the time, established a political border along the 22nd parallel north. This straight line was meant to simplify governance. But just 3 years later, in 1902, the British redrew a separate administrative border to reflect local realities, particularly the grazing needs of nomadic tribes. This second line placed Baarle inside Egypt and a far more desirable region, the Halib Triangle, inside Sudan. Fast forward to modern times, and both Egypt and Sudan wanted the Halib Triangle area on the Red Sea coast, rich in resources and far larger than Baarle. But claiming Halib meant acknowledging the administrative border of 1902, which in turn would cede Baarle to the other side. Conversely, claiming Baarle would mean giving up the Halib Triangle. The result, both nations refused Baarle entirely. Geographically, Baarle is stark and lifeless. It measures about 2,060 square kilometers, slightly smaller than Luxembourg, but it is almost entirely desert. With no permanent water sources, no known valuable minerals, and no established population. Temperatures can soar above 45 degrees Celsius in summer, and rainfall is almost non-existent. The land lies forgotten in the vast sand seas, accessible only by rugged desert tracks. Because neither Egypt nor Sudan claims it, Baarle is sometimes referred to as a true terra nullius, or land belonging to no one. In fact, It is one of the few habitable-sized pieces of land on Earth not officially claimed by any country. This strange status has captured the imagination of explorers, adventurers, and internet dreamers. Over the years, several individuals have staged symbolic micronation claims, declaring themselves kings or rulers of Baarle. These gestures, while playful or symbolic, have no legal recognition, but they highlight how rare such unclaimed land is in the modern world. One of the most famous cases came in 2014, when an American named Jeremiah Heaton traveled to Baarle and planted a flag, declaring it the Kingdom of North Sudan, so that his daughter could become a princess. While the stunt received media attention, it carried no legal weight. International law is clear. Simply planting a flag or declaring sovereignty does not make a nation. Still, the story captured people's fascination with the idea of forgotten lands. From a tourism perspective, Baarle is inaccessible and unwelcoming, yet it holds a peculiar allure. To stand there is to be in one of the rarest of geopolitical situations on land recognized by no country under no government's sovereignty. For adventurers, it represents the ultimate off-the-map experience. For geographers, it is a reminder of how arbitrary and fragile human boundaries can be. Yet Baarle is not entirely empty. Occasionally, nomadic tribes pass through with their herds, following ancient grazing routes. These movements are temporary and do not amount to settlement. But they remind us that even the harshest lands can be part of human life in subtle ways. The existence of Baarle also highlights a deeper truth about borders, that they are often not determined by geography or nature, but by history, negotiation, and sometimes error. The sands of the desert do not know whether they belong to Egypt or Sudan. It is only human politics that drew the lines and left Baarle in limbo. As you imagine the silent expanse of this unclaimed desert, picture the night sky above it. With no cities, no borders, and no ownership, Baarle offers one of the purest views of the stars anywhere in the world. Beneath those stars, the land lies untouched, waiting in stillness, as though it is content to belong to no one. From here, let us journey northward to another type of border. Anomaly, not an empty desert, but a city divided by two nations, where daily life requires crossing borders in the most ordinary of ways. That place is Baarle, a small town split between Belgium and the Netherlands, where international boundaries run through streets, shops, and even people's living rooms. Now, let us step away from the vast emptiness of Baarle and into a place that could not be more different. A lively town where borders do not repel people, but instead weave through their daily lives. This is Baarle, a settlement that exists partly in the Netherlands and partly in Belgium. It is often described as one of the strangest border puzzles in the entire world. At first glance, Baarle looks like any other quiet European town, with cobbled streets, bicycles leaning on walls, and spilling out onto shaded squares. But as you wander deeper, you realize that the ground beneath your feet is marked with white crosses and dotted lines, symbols that indicate where one country ends and the other begins. Some of these lines pass through sidewalks, others through businesses, and astonishingly, some even cut straight through houses. To understand this tangled geography, we need to go back several centuries. Long before the modern nation-states of Belgium and the Netherlands came into being. The origin lies in medieval feudal agreements between local dukes and nobles. Land in this area was exchanged, leased, or granted to various lords, creating a patchwork of ownership. When Belgium became independent from the Netherlands in 1831, this historical patchwork was preserved, solidifying Baarle's unusual status. Today, the result is a landscape of enclaves within enclaves. Baarle is divided into Baarle-Nassau, the Dutch portion, and Baarle-Hertog, the Belgian portion. But it is not a simple split. Instead, the Belgian part consists of 22 enclaves scattered inside Dutch territory. And within some of those Belgian enclaves are Dutch sub-enclaves. It is a geographical matryoshka, dull layers of borders nested inside one another. The consequences for daily life are charming and sometimes confusing. Imagine living in a house where the front door lies in Belgium, but the kitchen falls in the Netherlands. Taxes, utilities, and even the laws that govern your property can change depending on which side of the border the main entrance sits. This has led to quirky stories, such as businesses rearranging their doorways to benefit from more favorable regulations in one country or the other. Restaurants, for example, sometimes find their dining rooms straddling the boundary. In one cafe, tables on one side serve food under Belgian rules, while just a few feet away, customers technically sit in the Netherlands. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when each country had different lockdown measures, some businesses in Baarle operated with incredible creativity, closing only the tables that fell within one nation's jurisdiction, while leaving the others open. The borders are not hidden, they are celebrated. White crosses and dotted lines snake across streets and shop floors, turning ordinary walks into geographical adventures. Tourists often delight in standing with one foot in Belgium and one in the Netherlands, snapping photos as though they are in two worlds at once. In this sense, Baarle has turned its complex past into a unique form of cultural and tourism economy, welcoming visitors who are fascinated by the idea of borders woven so tightly into everyday life. Despite the division, or perhaps because of it, Baarle is also a symbol of European cooperation. Both Belgium and the Netherlands are part of the Schengen Agreement, meaning there are no physical border checks here. Residents cross from one side to the other without a second thought, their lives entwined with both national systems. The presence of two governments in a single town could easily cause friction, but instead it has fostered a spirit of collaboration. Municipal services, for example, are sometimes jointly managed. From a cultural perspective, Baarle has become a living museum of cartography, history, and diplomacy. It demonstrates how historical accidents can shape the present, and how communities adapt to make the best of unusual circumstances. It is a town where geography itself becomes part of identity. For travelers, visiting Baarle is both amusing and enlightening. Walking through its streets feels like flipping rapidly between two countries, yet with none of the tension usually associated with borders. Instead, there is a sense of playfulness, reminder that lines on a map can be not only points of division, but also sources of connection and curiosity. As night falls on Baarle, one can imagine the soft glow of streetlights illuminating those painted border markers, tiny lines that carry centuries of history. Unlike Baarle's silence, Baarle hums with life, laughter, and the easy rhythm of people who have learned to live with, cone, and even embrace one of the most complex borders in the world. From here, we will continue to yet another unusual case, not a land boundary, but a river border that shifts and meanders, creating constant challenges for governments and communities along its course. That story takes us to the mighty Rio Grande, the boundary between the United States and Mexico. Now we turn our gaze westward to a boundary that is not fixed in stone, nor etched into land, but instead drawn upon water, a living, moving line that refuses to stay still. This is the Rio Grande, known as the Bravo del Norte in Mexico, one of the most famous rivers in the world. It serves as a natural border between the United States and Mexico, stretching for more than 1,900 miles from the snow-fed peaks of Colorado, down through deserts and canyons, until it finally empties into the Gulf of Mexico. Borders defined by rivers are always dynamic, for rivers flow, bend, and shift. The Rio Grande is no exception. Over centuries, floods and erosion have altered its course many times, leaving governments to face a peculiar problem. If the river is the border, what happens when the river moves? In theory, international law distinguishes between two kinds of changes. If a river shifts gradually due to natural erosion or sedimentation, the border follows the new channel. But if a flood causes the river to suddenly jump its banks and carve a new path, the boundary remains where the river used to be. On paper, this sounds simple. In practice, it has led to decades of disputes, adjustments, and negotiations between Mexico and the United States. One of the most famous cases occurred in El Paso, Texas, and its neighboring city, Ciudad, in Mexico. In the mid-19th century, a major flood shifted the Rio Grande, moving the channel southward and leaving a small but important patch of land, known as the Chamizal, tracked on the wrong side of the river. For decades, both countries claimed it, and residents were left in limbo. Finally, after long negotiations, the Chamizal Treaty of 1963 returned the disputed land to Mexico. Today, a park commemorates this resolution, a rare moment when a border conflict ended peacefully through diplomacy rather than confrontation. The Rio Grande is not just a line on a map. It is a lifeline in an otherwise arid region, supporting agriculture, wildlife, and communities on both sides. Chaos. Yet its waters are scarce and precious, fueling additional challenges. Both nations rely on it for irrigation and drinking supplies, and treaties carefully divide its flow. But in times of drought, when the river runs thin, tensions sometimes rise. It is a reminder that borders are not only political, but also environmental, shaped by the natural world's rhythms. Along its course, the Rio Grande passes through landscapes of breathtaking beauty. In Big Bend National Park in Texas, the river carves deep canyons with sheer limestone cliffs rising hundreds of feet high. Here, the border feels less like a line of separation and more like a shared wonder, a place where tourists paddle kayaks, marvel at the geology, and listen to the echo of canyon walls. It is a reminder that nature often resists the boundaries we humans draw upon it. For the people who live along the Rio Grande, the border is both a challenge and a way of life. In towns like Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, families span both sides, culture flows back and forth, and festivals celebrate traditions that belong to neither one country nor the other, but to both. Economies intertwine as goods, food, and workers move daily across bridges. Even as politics debate lines, life on the ground continues in a rhythm that feels older than any treaty. One of the more curious aspects of the Rio Grande border is the presence of shifting islands and sandbanks. When the river drops in volume, sandbars emerge, sometimes large enough to walk across. Farmers and ranchers on either side have at times discovered that their land suddenly lies on the wrong bank. These small but significant shifts required careful attention from boundary commissions, which still meet regularly to manage the living line of the Rio Grande. In a sense, this border embodies the very essence of geography, is not static but alive. The river breathes, floods, and retreats. It carves valleys and nurtures ecosystems. And in doing so, it reminds us that the boundaries we draw are ultimately temporary arrangements upon a planet that is constantly in motion. Culturally, the Rio Grande has also inspired countless stories, songs, and artworks. For Mexican rancheras and American folk ballads alike, the river often symbolizes not just a boundary, but also longing, separation, and connection. Travelers describe it as both a barrier and a bridge, a paradox that defines much of human history. The desert air cools, stars begin to pierce the sky, and the water glimmers in soft moonlight. On one bank lies Mexico, on the other, the United States. Yet in that quiet moment, the river seems less like a divider and more like a thread, stitching together two worlds with its winding course. And so, the Rio Grande is not only a border, but also a lesson. It teaches us that lines on maps must bow to the forces of nature, and that cooperation is essential where resources are shared. It is a story of conflict, yes, but also of resolution, resilience, and the deep interconnection of land, water, and people. From this winding border of water, we will move next to a border that defies geography in another way, line drawn not by rivers or mountains, but by history itself. The curious case of Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave stranded on the shores of the Baltic Sea, awaits us. We now arrive at the final chapter of our journey, a border story, unlike the deserts, rivers, or enclaves we've explored before. This one belongs to the Baltic Sea, where history has carved out a fragment entirely separated from its homeland. Welcome to Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave nestled between Poland and Lithuania, with no land connection to the rest of Russia. Kaliningrad is peculiar not only for its geography, but also for its identity. Once this region was part of Prussia, and its capital was the German city of Kingsburg. For centuries, it was a center of culture, trade, and education. The philosopher Immanuel Kant lived and taught here. And the city was famous for its cathedral, its medieval fortifications, and the bridges that inspired mathematical puzzles in graph theory. Kingsburg's location on the Baltic made it a thriving port, linking the region to Scandinavia, Central Europe, and beyond. But the Second World War changed everything. In 1945, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union annexed Kingsburg and the surrounding area. The city was renamed Kaliningrad after a Soviet politician, and most of its German inhabitants were expelled. In their place, Soviet citizens from across Russia moved in, reshaping the population, language, and culture. The old German architecture was heavily damaged by bombing and largely replaced with Soviet-style concrete blocks. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Kaliningrad remained part of the Russian Federation. Yet suddenly, it was cut off from the rest of Russia by the newly independent nations of Lithuania, Latvia, and Belarus. What was once a coastal outpost of the USSR became a lonely fragment of Russia inside the European Union's sphere of influence. This geographic situation makes Kaliningrad one of the most unique borderlands in the world. Its people carry Russian passports, use the ruble, and follow Moscow's laws, but their nearest neighbors are EU citizens. To travel by land to mainland Russia, Kaliningrad residents must pass through at least one foreign country, often requiring visas and careful coordination. This isolation has created both challenges and opportunities. Economically, Kaliningrad has been developed as a special economic zone, encouraging trade, tourism, and business. Its Baltic coastline is home to beautiful beaches and dunes, particularly along the Curonian Spit, a UNESCO World Heritage Site shared with Lithuania. Here, sand formations shift like desert waves, forests cling to fragile soil, and migratory birds pause on their long journeys across continents. It is a natural wonder in a place that is often thought of only in terms of politics. Kaliningrad is also significant for its military role. During the Cold War, it served as a heavily fortified base for the Soviet Navy, and even today, it houses important Russian military installations. This has led to tensions with NATO countries nearby, reminding us that borders are not only cultural, but also strategic. Yet beyond geopolitics, the everyday life of Kaliningraders tells another story. Many feel both Russian and European, their identity shaped by a unique blend of influences. Some cherish the remnants of German heritage, from old buildings to street names that recall Kingsburg's past. Others emphasize ties to Russia, celebrating Orthodox traditions, Russian literature, and connections to Moscow. This coexistence of layers Prussian, Soviet, Russian makes Kaliningrad a living museum of border history. Perhaps the strangest aspect of Kaliningrad's border reality is how ordinary it can feel. For students crossing to study in Poland, for families shopping in Lithuania, or for tourists arriving from Scandinavia, the exclave functions like any other borderland where cultures meet and overlap. Life continues with markets, festivals, and seaside vacations, even as maps remind us of the region's unusual status. Kaliningrad, like so many of the borders we've explored, illustrates how history shapes geography, and how geography, in turn, shapes identity. Borders are not static. They move, dissolve, reappear, and sometimes leave behind fragments like this one. The exclave is a reminder that the world we inhabit is the result of countless past choices, conflicts, and agreements layered upon one another like sediments in a riverbank. As we conclude this long and soothing exploration of the world's oddest borders, let us reflect on what ties all these stories together. From enclaves, like Baarle, to deserts divided by invisible lines. From rivers that shift their channels to exclaves cut off from their homelands. Borders are ultimately human creations, imposed upon landscapes that rarely obey them. And yet, these lines shape how we live, trade, travel, and imagine our place in the world. For the traveler, borders may be checkpoints or bridges. For the historian, they are records of past struggles. For those living along them, they are daily realities, sometimes sources of difficulty, sometimes of opportunity. And for us tonight, drifting toward rest, borders are stories. They are reminders of humanity's endless creativity, complexity, and resilience. So, as you close your eyes, picture the world's map not as a rigid pattern of lines, but as a flowing, shifting canvas. Imagine rivers carving paths, mountains rising, cities bridging divides, and people living their lives along these curious edges. Geography is alive, and borders add, though they may be our ongoing tale. Thank you for joining me in this quiet journey through 30 strange borders and country lines explained. If you enjoyed this exploration, I invite you to subscribe for more calming geography journeys. Leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, and drift gently into dreams filled with rivers, deserts, enclaves, and the curious edges of our shared world.